Thank you, panel chair and panel members. My name's Simon Perrin, a member of the Bendigo District Environment Council. I'm a retired anaesthetist, retired in 2016 from anaesthetic practice and retired from medical practice in 2021. The link between anaesthetics and mining, or the link that brought me towards examining mining, was the basic sciences of anaesthesia, which is clinical physiology and clinical pharmacology. It's a bit like surgeons learn anatomy first before they actually cut with a knife. Anaesthetists need to learn physiology and pharmacology before they practice anaesthetics. The other, we teach young anaesthetists a stanza: trust no one, believe no one, and in anaesthetics it's give oxygen. And that we use that because you need to be very sure of the information you're given is correct before you act on that information. That will become relevant later on. A brief outline of my presentation. I'll talk about BDEC's history. I'll discuss the EES process a little bit, accepting consultants' advice, some examples of regulatory failure and loss of control after EES approval. Then I'll discuss arsenic contamination and dust dispersion, and a very brief mention of first flush devices. BDEC's history with regarding to mining. BDEC originated back in 1987 when Western Mining Company wanted to mine underneath our water supply. BDEC vigorously, I was called Friends for Forests back then, we vigorously opposed the mine at the EES, and eventually we were successful with getting the Western Mining proposal rejected. We've done 12, I was just counting before, I think we've actually done 13 mining EESs we've been involved with, and 6 of those have been outside Bendigo. The qualifications BDEC has amongst its members are fairly impressive. I won't list through them. Most members have tertiary qualifications and have lectured at a tertiary level. We've had our members have been employed in local councils, state governments, Environment Victoria, Land Conservation Councils, UNESCO, and we have 3 local field naturalists, ecologists with 30 plus years experience. You've met 2 of them this morning that have presented prior to me. Main problem, sorry, I'll go back if we can. Not going to let me. Why do we get involved? The main problem is dysregulation. Our regulators, particularly EPA, Earth Resources, Health Department, plus or minus council, we don't expect so much of council, are completely incapable of regulating a mining industry. We've seen this repeatedly, and I'll produce some examples later on. If the regulators did their job properly, we probably wouldn't need to be here today. The other reason we get involved is because of the participation process and just the sheer challenge for a local landowner, or sensitive receptors as they're now known, to deal with the EES process. First of all, they get landed with something like 5,200 pages in this case, 24 chapters, 25 technical reports, 5 attachments, 4 summary documents, and when they get their brain wrapped around that, there's still another 100 pieces of information requested by the panel, RFIs, and then there's another 200 tabled documents just to keep them on their toes. So these are generally farming people. Very few of them have tertiary degrees. These are all highly technical documents, most of them scientific in nature. And the sensitive receptors are expected to wrap their brains around the 5,000 pages of documents without a tertiary qualification. It's just simply impossible for them. So that's partly why we get involved. Just the injustice of the process. Excuse me. Then there's the time pressure. They're generally given 12 weeks to cross-reference, spot multiple errors, and as we've discovered already, multiple bits of missing information. What we don't know is whether that missing information has been deliberately concealed. The last problem in the EES process is onus of proof. This was presented by Mr. Stuart Morris, SC, at the Fingerboards hearing in 2021 in Gippsland, and in his closing summary, this statement was made. In fact, the application of the concept of an onus of proof is particularly inapposite in the context of an administrative inquiry under the EEE Act, because the function of the inquiry and the minister following the inquiry is fact-finding. Neither an inquiry nor the minister are required to make a decision. And the simple translation of that is that there's no rules of evidence. So there's no penalty for lying, there's no penalty for obscuring documents, there's no penalty or need to present documents. The further challenges that a sensitive receptor might face dealing with an EES: there's no financial assistance, unlike the proponent where it's all tax deductible. For the local sensitive receptors, there's no tax deductibility. Consultants cost tens of thousands of dollars. I would hazard a guess that many people that are appearing for this EES are actually on healthcare cards. I don't know how they afford a consultant to try and counteract any information put forward by the proponent. There's this inherent assumption that landholders or sensitive receptors are tech savvy and can afford at least a medium grade to high grade computer, which is what you need to run Teams, especially if you're going to present using screen share from a remote location. Finally, the EES is a life-threatening or has life-changing consequences for those sensitive receptors. They see this as basically the end of their life as they know it. The process is terribly, terribly destructive. These people that are sensitive receptors, as they are attempting to mount a response, still have to hold down employments. They don't have a legal team of $10,000 a day sitting there doing all the consulting for them and collating for them. They have to run their own business. They have to run their own families. At the same time, they have to respond to an EES, which is done in their leisure time. It's done on weekends. It's done at 2 o'clock in the morning. Their life is totally paralysed for at least the 5 or 6 months that an EES runs. It splits communities. There are the people in the community that believe the expansion of the mine will profit. They'll profit from that either through employment or consultancies, versus those who will have uprooted lives. Invariably, the people that think they will profit from the system don't live in the area affected by the mine. The other problem is the process itself creates illness in families and the people presenting, and there's no concession offered should that happen during the EES process. There's no one to fill in, there's no extra body to take over the legal presentation, the advocation, to advocate. There's no one else that can step in and do their presentation. The mining companies are well aware of this, and they use this as a part of their modus operandi to put pressure on communities. There are more flaws in the EES process. Public participation. This a book published by, authored by Alderman Harris and Hill in 1984 is still relevant 40 years later. The book was called Planning for Public.
Interrupt you briefly, only to comment on our report and our role in this process. We can't actually comment or do anything about the EES process per se or as it is. Please keep going, but just bear in mind that we're only commenting on essentially the effects on the environment. So the actual process is something that we can't comment on at all.
Thank you. And continuing in that book, page 183, planning authorities are likely to view their relationship with the major elites as consultation, but a similar status is not afforded to the voluntary bodies or members of the public at large. I would present the following examples. On the bus tour, the company was free to promote whatever it wanted to. Once we were off the bus on private property, we had the proponents' legal team guillotining conversations, guillotining questions, and what particularly distressed me, the panel supported the proponent. The panel appeared to be just dutifully obedient to the proponent. And the same thing happened to Mr.
Being obedient to the proponent. I will interject now because that isn't correct.
I'm only stating how it appears from
It
outside.
doesn't look like that, but the whole process is to do with what we think assists us in our role in the process, and site inspections are really to facilitate our viewing of the site, and it's not an opportunity for members of the public for the proponent as well.
Given the opportunity to spruik their side of events during that bus tour. I'll move on. I'd like to discuss conclaves. There is a big problem with conclaves. We've found this in medicine. We have conclaves in medicine, consensus statements. And some may remember the OxyContin crisis in America that cost many lives. It's a potent opiate. The consensus statement regarding pain management with an opiate was dominated by the company that produced OxyContin. And subsequently, most medical societies have put out their own directions on how conclaves or consensus statements will be practiced. There are a few features that are relevant to conclaves. The first one is the chair or co-chair shall not have a conflict of interest. First thing that happens in the conclaves here is the chair is appointed by the company or the company representative or paid by the company. Second thing, the panel should be multidisciplinary. Remember, the EPA asked to be involved. That was rejected, not by the panel, by the proponent, but was subsequently agreed to by the panel. And the last thing I would mention is the panel should include a patient or patient advocate, e.g. a sensitive receptor or an advocate for the sensitive receptor. They may not have to participate, but they should at least be offered to witness the discussion. Sorry, wrong direction. And then there's a problem after the EES. What's agreed to in an EES has absolutely no resemblance to the subsequent practices after the EES. The earth resources are in a perilous state as of the EPA. They're under-resourced, undermanned, under-educated most importantly, and no one, or at least we don't believe they're motivated to protect human safety or assets. Their primary function appears to be promoting mining or facilitating mining, and we see no evidence for the EPA as any different. Work plan variations, which have been mentioned, occurs without public notification, and I find that terribly distressing. At least the public should be notified about what's happening, even if they don't get much say in what's happening. Environmental review committees either don't exist or have been nobbled to the extent that they no longer function to protect the public. we've had reports that community members on environmental review committees have been asked to sign confidentiality clauses that they will not discuss anything they hear outside the environmental review committee. I don't know quite what to say to that. Here we have a company where we know arsenic is going off-site and people have been requested to sign confidentiality agreements. I'd like to move on.
Sorry, don't mean to keep interrupting you. We've just got a break scheduled for 11:30 and I just saw you going on to another topic. Would this be a good time just to have a 15-minute break?
Yep, that's it.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's come back at 11:45. Okay, thank you, Dr. Perrin. We're back with you. Actually, one thing, can I just quickly clarify? We've got you on this afternoon as well from 4 o'clock. Are you coming?
Yeah, I think that's an error.
Okay, so this is no problems.
Yep.
Just wanted to check that. Thank you. No, I did see that advice. I just wasn't sure if he was doing two separate submissions. So no, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to talk about accepting consultants' advice unchallenged. Consultants there's three major problems. One's their area of focus, two's their reliability, and three, we come back to that old chestnut, onus of proof. Consultants are specialists by nature. Their area of expertise, whether it be health or air quality or water, that is their area of expertise. They have very little generalist knowledge and are unable to extend that knowledge to an entire mine site and predict what's going to happen across the mine site, the interaction of what they're doing with what else is happening in the mine site. They're unable to assess the data they've been given and the accuracy of the data they've been given relative to what else is going on in the mine site. They're specialists, which is what we expect of specialists. This is a publication by Driscoll et al. It was an Australian survey of 350 environmental consultants, ecologists, and it was published in Conservation Letters in 2020. There's the abstract, I won't go through that. And cutting to the chase of what they found that essentially 30% of government and industry respondents reported interference by their employers of what they were presenting. Compared with university respondents, only 5% reported any interference in what they were presenting. Most of those interferences were either related to media reports or internal communications. I would argue any communications between a consultant and the proponent is internal communication. And we're not privy to those internal communications. We might be told what draft we're looking at and how many drafts there were. We're not told of what changes were made in those drafts before it met the proponent's approval. And we come back to that onus of proof again. There's no obligation for rules of evidence, for truthfulness, for completeness. So accepting a consultant's opinion, that you've got the problem of focus, you've got the problem of reliability, we've got the problem of onus of proof, and for the consultants themselves, if they don't produce a document the proponent requires, they have difficulty getting employment in the future across the mining industry. The mining industry is a very closed industry, and if the consultant gets a bad reputation from one mine, they won't get another job. There's also there's a lot of pressure on the consultants to produce exactly what the proponent wants, and there's no enforceable code of conduct. In the event, they're effectively just advocates for the proponent. I'll briefly move on to discussing the regulation of the mining industry. I was going to talk about technical reference groups. I won't talk too much about this, but there's a lot of missing information that we don't know about that should have been picked up at the technical reference group stage. We've got all the regulators on there, we've got water bodies on there, we've got transport authorities on there, and no one noticed the information that you requested, the RFIs. No one noticed the missing dust data. No one noticed there was already contamination happening out there. And the EES was ticked off. I won't go into why that can happen. I think I mentioned that in my written submission. But for an example of loss of control, once an EES is approved, is rehabilitation. We all sit there and study the rehabilitation proposed, but I've yet to find one mine site in Victoria, even Australia, where rehabilitation has been completed. This was in 1998 at the Deborah Gold panel report, page 57, I think, yep. The proposed end use of the Carlsharlton site is returned to box ironbark forest while retaining the area for use as a historic reserve. A significant proportion of the proposed rehabilitation works will be completed during and immediately following decline development phase. There's progressive rehabilitation 30 years later. It's just a moonscape. The state is now the crown owner of that site, and we estimate the cost will be something like $300 to $500 million to rehabilitate, if it ever gets rehabilitated. Another example of poor regulation is Fosterville. This is the Brunswick pit at Fosterville. Back in about 2012, they had a bit of a water problem at Fosterville. So someone came up with the bright idea. We'd spray the water into the air and evaporate it. That water contained 50 micrograms of lead. Lead is a permanent neurotoxin in children. It causes long-term brain injury and long-term intellectual impairment. It also contained 30 milligrams of antimony. The ERC committee knew that. There was a health department, Earth Resources, EPA sitting on that Earth committee. And they said, yeah, go ahead, spray it in the air. I don't know whether they expected the lead and the antimony to drop back down into the pond and the water to evaporate. 2 years later, there's illness right through the community. Someone decided to test their water tank and the antimony levels were through the roof. And then the government decided it would do its own investigation, and sure enough, there was antimony and lead everywhere. That sounds pretty bad. Even worse to come, what they didn't do was tell anyone for 2 years. They concealed that information. They set up a special committee and they concealed that information from the community. The problem with that is if you go to Mount Isa, Port Pirie, anywhere like that, the moment there's even a hint of lead out there, they run around and they do finger pricks on every child to see whether they've got lead contamination. That didn't happen here. They actually hid the results for 2 years. After 6 months, the lead in children's blood disappears. 2 years there was never going to be any evidence it will ever happen, and you won't know until all these children start failing in high school, which is probably about now. Then there's Woodvale. There's the Woodvale Ponds. That is about 2 kilometres long and about 800 metres wide. That red star in the middle, the concentration of, down in the bottom right-hand corner, the concentration of arsenic there is about 25,000 milligrams per kilogram. It's just an extraordinary concentration. The yellow stars are residences. The 3 yellow stars down in the bottom right-hand corner, 2 of those used to have children. I think only one of those currently has a child. We know dust is going off-site from this place. In 2015, they tested water tanks within a 1 kilometre radius of this site. 80% of them contained arsenic, of which about half of those contained 2 micrograms per litre or more of arsenic. And we had the EPA, they told us that was safe. We'll talk about the levels of arsenic in a few minutes. You may remember when we were discussing tailings dams with Mr. Shepherd, I believe it was, and he said, oh, that's all right, the tailings dam will crust and they won't form dust. This is the close-up of that tailings dam at Woodvale. You can see the crust, yes, it has crusted. You can see the crust cracking. It's a bit hard to see. You can sort of imagine it there. But on the top of that is a really fine talcum powder. That's called efflorescence. That's PM10 size. And that contains, at Woodvale, that little section of dust, one Woodvale resident snuck out there and got me a sample, contained 40,000 milligrams per kilogram of arsenic, that efflorescence. I would maintain the efflorescence will be found on top of the Fosterville tailings dams, but we don't know because no one's checked. No one's measuring dust coming off the top of the tailings dams at Fosterville. Then there's Fosterville itself. That's back in 2002 or somewhere around there. And 20 years later, we've got this massive expansion with huge tailings dams, I think containing something like 20 million cubic metres of tailings. And, with arsenic coming off the site there. That's all been done on a work plan variation. Community wasn't informed. It was just done. Just a little talk between Earth Resources and the company, and go ahead. Coming down to arsenic now. Arsenic, the most dangerous form of arsenic is inorganic soluble arsenic. It is the number one toxin on the American toxic register, toxic substances and disease register. Compare with asbestos, which is number 96. They both have no known safe levels of exposure. Arsenic's number 1, asbestos is 96. Cancers that can be caused by arsenic. I'll start down the right-hand side. Skin cancers, oropharyngeal cancers, esophageal cancers, throat cancers, lung cancers. Lungs particularly sensitive because any arsenic that gets into the body partly is excreted via the lung. And so the lung is particularly sensitive to any arsenic exposure or absorption from any system. Kidney cancer, bladder cancer, gastrointestinal cancer, liver cancer. Also, the problem with this is the latency is 15 to 30 years between exposure and the cancer coming. No one's going to connect those cancers with that exposure, or very unlikely, unless they've lived next to the mine and they've stayed next to the mine. If they move away, get cancer in 20 years' time, they're not going to think back and say, oh, that's where it came from, and their doctors won't think back Oh, where did you live when you were a child? Prenatal exposure in utero causes cancer in the offspring between the ages of 30 and 40, not 50 and 60 and 70 when we all get cancers, but 30 and 40-year-olds if you're exposed in utero. That's just the Californian calculation of excess deaths from exposure to arsenic and the water tank concentrations or water concentrations corresponding it. I've summarised it in the next table. The Australian Water Guidelines are 10 micrograms per litre. That's an excess cancer death of 1 in 400 over a lifetime exposure. At 4 micrograms, the excess cancer death rate is 1 in 1,000 patients will have a excess cancer. 1 in 1,000 exposures will have an excess cancer death. At 0.3 micrograms, that's starting to get down to the limits of detectability. The cancer rate is 1 in 13,000 exposures. Remember, this is water. And to get down to what I believe is the standard harm rate, acceptable harm rate, you need 0.04 micrograms or 40 nanograms per litre to get to the 1 in 100,000 excess cancer deaths from exposed people. And this was known, or what I didn't mention, arsenic's been known as a carcinogen since 1979. It was declared by WHO, World Health Organization, as a carcinogen. And in their guidelines, when they decided they'd use 10 micrograms per litre as the standard, they knew then that you needed to have 0.17 micrograms per litre to achieve the 1 in 100,000 risk of skin cancer alone. That's not lung cancer, liver cancer, or any other cancer. That's just skin cancer alone. So they knew 30 years ago that there was a problem, and what they were recommending wasn't safe. Their recommendation was taken because third world countries, one, couldn't measure below 10 micrograms per litre, and two, they could, if they did measure it, they couldn't reduce the arsenic in their water below that level. Third world countries didn't have the technology. And we come to Fosterville, and we look at the water tanks at Fosterville. There's arsenic everywhere out there. And there's reasonably high concentrations of arsenic. There's even some extreme concentrations. What I find interesting, they're all south of the tailings dam. I cannot guess where this arsenic's coming from if it's not blowing off the top of the tailings dam. Nothing else makes sense. Then you look at the arsenic around in dust deposition monitors. The yellow circles that you see there are all the results we haven't been given and all the results the companies promised to give us tonight after my talk, I believe. And as you can see, if you go outside the mine site, the concentration of arsenic in dust will be basically less than 14 milligrams per kilogram. Looking on this diagram, we see the concentrations of arsenic 50 milligrams per kilogram, 31, 26. Then as you go south of the actual tailings dam, 270 at FA11, 470 at high volume monitoring HVAS1, at HVAS2, which is even further south, you see 113 milligrams per kilogram. Also down there's a 93 south of the tailings dam, there's a 33 south of the tailings dam. And even when you go, the green circle is 4 kilometres around the tailings dam, just to give you some orientation of distance. So when you go 8 kilometres away from the tailings dam, there's still arsenic appearing down there at HVAS3. It's only 43 milligrams per kilogram. And that's PM10 arsenic, remember? And I'll explain how the arsenic's getting down there shortly. But it's everywhere. And most of those monitors are on the edge of the mine or just off the edge of the mine. So there's no doubt arsenic's going off-site at this mine. And they want to double the size of the tailings dam. They want to double the size of the operations. We'll call this the Kirkland diagram. This is HS, high volume monitoring of PM10 at HVAS 1 and 2. And you can see the first line is the bottom red line. Now, that was the standard back in 2017 before the change in the EPA Act. That's 3 nanograms, or keep it simple, we're talking nanograms, that's the 3 nanogram level. And you see the HSV1 arsenic is the red dots, and you can see how many red dots. In actual fact, 62% of the red dots were above that line. I don't know what our regulators are doing. They're sitting around an ERC meeting being told there's arsenic exceeding the limits, and they're not doing anything. This dates back to 2015. Remember, the standard didn't change till somewhere around 2018. Then it went to 15 nanograms, 5 times. So apparently arsenic is, the potency of arsenic reduced by 5 over a 5-year period. And so the standard is now 15 nanograms, which is that line is the 18 nanogram line, which is where the company thinks the background level should now be regarded. And you can see they were still way above it. There were still multiple measurements above that, even above that line. And as you move across, you get to March 2020, and you see that a red line, vertical red line. What happened then? It started raining. I'll show a diagram of that in a minute. And all of a sudden, the arsenic levels are below the APAC level of 15 nanograms. So it was nothing the company did. It just started raining. The company's dependent on rain to control their arsenic levels. This is a complicated diagram, which I apologise for. The company wishes to use the background level of arsenic as 18 nanograms or 0.018 nanograms as their, so 0.018 micrograms per metre cubed as their baseline. I'll say 18 nanograms because it's easier to manage. However, if you choose HSVAS 3, high volume monitor at 3 as the background concentration, and that was 0.6 nanograms at HVAS 3. And if you put that into the calculation, so using 18 nanograms, you go right over to the right-hand side and the black percentages, oh, that looks really good. They've done really well. And when the project starts up, it's only going to be a really tiny contribution to the excess arsenic. It's in the low single-figure percentages. If you use the 0.6 nanogram figure as the background, suddenly the percentage of the project enhancement is 62, 59, 29, 66, 61, 54%. A huge increase in the amount of arsenic that's probably in the true background arsenic. That's why the company wants to use 18 nanograms as their background. I'll move on and talk a little bit about dust. This is from the 1995 EES. As you can see, they've been monitoring dust at Fosterville for a very long time. This is 1990. They started monitoring it. the FA1 to FA7s that I requested the other day, they've got 35 years of dust monitoring data out there. They don't need to calculate backgrounds. They know exactly what the pre-industrial mining background level was. I've blacked out all the names. They're off-sites and they're on local farms. They know exactly what the background dust level is. They know exactly what the off-site background dust level is. I have no idea why they've gone through the charade of using models and error mode models and calculating the background dust levels using that. And what they found, what they reported in the 1995 EES was very low levels of dust. Surprise, surprise. 0.74 grams per metre squared per month was the average across those 7 dust deposition gauges. That was between 1990 and 1995. That looks like a pretty good background level to me, prior to industrial scale mining. Then you look at what they've reported from, I think this was 2017 to 2021, during industrial mining, and the dust deposition rate is now 1.25 grams per metre squared per month, an increase of 66% since the onset of industrial mining. This is a website called Wet Earth. They supply dust control to the mining industry. And the reason I'm pointing to this website is they supply this data of lift-off velocities for dust. It looks a little bit complicated. The ones we're interested in are dirt, which is 1,300 kilograms per metre cubed, or 1.3 grams per cc. And the heavier one, which we'll play with the heavier one most of the time, which is 2,200 kilograms per metre cubed, or 2.2 grams per cc. The lift-off velocity of a 100 microgram particle, this is a big particle. Okay. Most of dust deposition particles will be in the 30 to 50 microgram range, so this is a big particle. And they'll be picked up, lift off, say, sitting on the top of a tailings dam. It will lift off at 40 kilometres per hour. And if you've got a PM10 particle, it will be lifting off at roughly 16 kilometres per hour. That's just a slight breeze, 16 kilometres per hour. So it is easily achievable for dust to be lifting off the tailings dams. This is Reynolds' number, Stokes's number, Stokes's equation, and that's, you use this to determine how far dust will actually travel once it's elevated. This was a graph drawn for me by Professor Peter Wycheck and Dr. John Roberts at the University of Wollongong. They plugged the data in for me and drew the graph so that I could demonstrate what happens once the dust, how far dust will travel once it's in the air. Now this was used for another occasion. The dust density here is very heavy. It's 3,500 kilograms per metre squared. Very heavy dust. So this is going to travel. Any other dust coming from any other site will travel far further than what's described here. I'd like you to look at the 40 kilometre hour line and working your way up. So this is dust coming off at 10 metre height. Remember, the tailings dams are at least 20 metres. So dust coming off at 10 metre height on that thick grey line going across on the blue for a 30 micron particle, it will travel at 1.2 kilometres or thereabouts. Make that a 20 metre height, and that dust particle will travel 2.4 kilometres. Now remember, this this graph is for dust that's at least 50% heavier than what we're dealing with out there. At 50% to that second or top red arrow, and dust lifting off that tailings dam is going to travel of the order of 4 kilometres. Looks like 3.6 there. It's of the order of 4 kilometres. So 1, we know dust is going to lift off the tailings dam. 2, we know it's going to travel at least 4 kilometres, or the dust that's going to settle in dust deposition gauges is going to travel at least 4 kilometres. If you're talking about PM10 dust, roughly if they're about the 12 kilometre mark, that PM10 dust will travel 4 kilometres. So at a much lower, just in a gentle breeze, PM10 dust, once it's elevated, will travel that 4 kilometres on a very mild breeze. Then you look at the wind speeds in the last 12 months at Bendigo Airport. There were 86 days greater than 25. Well, that picks up at least 86 days. That's at 30%, 25%, sorry, days in the year where the PM10 dust will be picked up. And if that PM10 dust is efflorescence, it probably contains 50,000 micrograms per kilogram, milligrams per kilogram, sorry, of arsenic. So if that dust, so there's at least 25% of the days where that dust, PM10 dust, can be picked up. And there were 39 days greater than 40 kilometres per hour. This is from the north winds blowing over the top of the tailings dams. So there are at least 39 days where that dust can be picked up or be elevated in the air. And then we go back and look at our distribution of where the arsenic's going, and it's nearly all south of the mine. It's possible there's just no measurements above the north of the mine. I don't quite know why that is, but there were a couple of measurements there that we haven't been given on the northeast section. That would be interesting to know. This is a cross-section from the tailings dams, or it actually starts out in the North Plains, and cross-section to the tailings dams and through to nearly to Axedale. And the heavy red line in the middle from the tailings dam gives you is the red section down below in the cross-sectional diagram. So right at the beginning of the red section, where the white line is under white arrow, that's the top of TSF1, and about 1 square along is TSF4. The distance of that white arrow is 4.5 kilometres. Remember that 4 kilometre circle? It seemed to be where all the arsenic was landing. That's at FA11, which had the extraordinary high levels of arsenic, and high volume monitor 1 also had the extraordinary high levels of arsenic. They're 4 kilometres. Monitor 1 was picking up PM10 dust from gentle breezes. FA11 was picking up the dust deposition from winds probably of the order of 40 kilometres per hour. I've just drawn in a little black line there on the likely trajectory of dust. This is in technical note 2, I think. I'm not sure whether this was presented by Mr. Shepherd or not. It may have been. But this is a graph of PM10 dust. And as you can see, they're sort of exceeding between 2017 and 2020. They were sort of sitting around the allowable limit, the APAC limit. And then they sprayed McCormick's Road and the dust magically disappeared or reduced down to an acceptable standard. Yeah, they sprayed McCormick's Road. Then you look at the rainfall in that period. Now, for the 3 years before they sprayed McCormick's Road, the average rainfall was 20% less than the long-term average. About the time they sprayed McCormick's Road, the average rainfall the following 3 years was 10% greater than the long-term average. But they're claiming they controlled the dust. I submit that it was the rainfall that controlled the dust, and they were just lucky. This diagram, I'll skip this diagram because I don't know anything. I haven't been given the information to talk more about this diagram. I'm nearly finished. Thank you for your patience. First flush devices. I think it was Dr. Wright that mentioned first flush devices as being a mechanism to protect houses and protect drinking water. And she quoted this article as her evidence that first flush devices work. What she didn't do was read the whole article. First flush devices are very good for removing organic matter. Even the standard, the usual ones are usually about 14 to 20 litres. They're very good at removing organic matter. But then you read the fine detail in this, and I'll get you to look at the dissolved solid lines. So to reduce dissolved solids, 75%. Remember, this arsenic is almost certainly soluble, and it's landing on rooftops. To reduce the soluble salts for 75%, so in this case it's 173 to 39, you need a first flush device that captures the first 5 millimetres of rainfall, which is about the circle above the 39. 5 millimetres of rainfall on a 200 metre square roof, you need a 1,000 litre flush device to capture that water, the first 1,000 litres. Capturing the first 20 is a waste of time. It's not going to reduce the arsenic in the water tanks, which is probably why most of these people probably have first flush devices for their water tanks, but that's why it's not working, because they need to have 1,000 litre flush devices, not 20 litre flush devices. So that's about all I've got to say. The perilous state of Earth resources and regulators, they just can't do the job they've been asked to do, and I'm not even sure they want to do the job they've been asked to do. Work plan variations, we don't quite know how the new legislation is going to work, but work plan variations, things happen without the public even knowing, and they get scattered with arsenic and never get the opportunity to find out that it's happening. Their environmental review committees may well not exist the way they're structured at the moment. And as I mentioned, we have no idea about what's going to happen with the amendments to the MRSD Act and the Planning Act and how that'll interact. I've noticed the panel seems to be right on top of that change, and I'm very grateful for that. Then we've got the onus of proof problem propping up again. Arsenic's everywhere. Remind you of that little dust coming across. A stanza for the mining, trust no one, believe no one, and follow the money. Thank you very much for your time.